Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. Today we have an interview with Mitch Barnett of Accurate Sound. He's going to talk about DSP, room correction, and speakers. And these three things are the most important things in your audio system. If you get these things right, the majority of your audio problems are solved. You want to find out what Mitch is talking about? Watch the video. Roll the intro! All right, folks, welcome to HionHiFi again. We're doing another interview today with Mitch Barnett of Accurate Sound Reproduction Services. If you're around the internet and in hi-fi, you've probably seen Mitch write articles, excellent articles all around the internet, but most notably, I would imagine, at AUDIOPHILE Style. He usually talks on the topic of DSP. He's an expert in that. He wrote a book in that. And so we have the pleasure today of him basically presenting us with a masterclass in DSP, and how it applies to, hi-fi audio reproduction. I'm super excited. I can't really contain myself, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my absolute best here because I think. Listen, folks, if you're an audio nut like me, this is probably going to be, by virtue of how big of an impact your room has on the sound, one of the most important interviews that I do, because this has such a big impact on getting good sound that if you listen to what he's going to tell you, you can drastically improve the sound quality of your stereo system. And it does not require $10,000 audio cables or pseudoscientific components that are supposed to magically give you high fidelity, which is so if you've watched any of my interviews, you guys know that I'm on a crusade against the pseudoscience that we have in hi-fi audio. it's so pervasive, it's sickening. So we're gonna get a bit different approach. So if you're here for smoke and mirrors stuff, and for us to tell you that a battery inside of your speaker cable is going to make it sound eons better, this is the wrong place for you. If you're here to get stuff that can be measured, stuff that we can objectively measure and prove, this is the right place. And if you want to know about room correction DSP, this is the place to do it. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the important bits. This is an educational kind of an interview, so I'm hoping that you'll get a lot of value out of it, because I know that I'm going to be listening and hoping that I get a lot of value out of it too. I'm pretty sure I will. So Mitch's company, Accurate Sound, they calibrate loudspeakers in rooms to the same industry standards used in professional recording studios. So the net result of that for you is accurate in-room sound reproduction. Mitch also wrote a book in 2016 called Accurate Sound Reproduction Using DSP. He's written many articles, just excellent articles, walking layman like myself through all kinds of DSP products, how to set them up, what to click, where to click. He really is the kind of audiophile that I like to see. He's a show and tell audiophile. So I like that kind of audiophile. Mitch, welcome. Thank you for doing the interview. And what's going on? Tell us about yourself. How'd you get here? All that stuff.
Thomas, thanks, man. That's a very nice introduction of you, and thanks for having me on your show, man. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
And like I say, I'm hopeful that this is going to be educational, and I won't try and get too geeked out and technical, but it is quite the technical topic. But and so, to step back a little bit and, how did I arrive here? That's a great question. And so, many years ago, I would say, actually, while I was growing up, my mom used to play piano, and my dad was an audiophile. He had one of those giant Heath kits back then that were, huge speaker, mono speaker, and a 6-watt amp and a record changer. And I remember I bought my first album. I think it was, it was either Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple, Made in Japan, something like that. And I remember the first time that they went out, and I got to play that on the stereo and turned it up loud. And right there, I knew, man, I love this. This is fantastic. So that was kind of my introduction into kind of audio and sound. And then from there, I became more interested in that while I was going to school. Some buddies of mine started up a band. And so I was hanging around the band, and they were looking for someone to help them record some stuff. And so I'm industrious kind of guy, and so I started learning how do you actually record things, and bought a few books at the time, and then at the time I was working at an electronics engineering company. That's my background, is electronics engineering. And at night, I would go down to the club and watch the band. And one night the sound guy didn't show up, and they said, "Hey man, we need your help. Like, can you sit behind the board and mix the sound?" I said, "Sure, why not? I'll give it a try."
Yeah. And
And
basically, you're their front of house.
that's right, totally.
FOH, yeah.
It was awesome, and so and they liked what I did, and I liked what I was doing, and so in a very short order of time, even though I was really young back then, I still couldn't do an 8 to 5 job and then hang out, mix sound at the club till 2, 3 in the morning, and then
Yeah.
try and get up. So I made a choice.
You couldn't do that? What do you mean? Really, I think you could do it, but it's a question of for how long can you do it?
that's
And
that's
does
the
it pay the
trick.
bills?
That's the trick, man. So, and sleep deprivation at the time was high on my list, and pretty soon I was kind of like Fight Club. I didn't know, what time it was, where I was, what was going on.
Right.
So
An alternate universe going on, yeah.
that's right. So I ditched the electronics job at the time and just went on the road with the band, and um, you know that was a lot of fun. And it happened that the one of the guys at the local recording studio saw me mix sound and said, "Hey, we're looking for a guy that can run our recording studio." And I said, "Sure, I'm very interested in that." And so that was the start of my recording and mixing career. And over 10 years, I mixed sound live with a variety of bands on the road. And when I wasn't doing that, I was in the studio recording and mixing bands. And it turned out to be a number of studios across Western Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world. I love the creative process of folks being in the studio and watching how they put together the material, rehearse, practice, and then lay down the tracks.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating process because it's much different than I think what most people think.
Yeah.
And it's also the output is like most people, they hear the finished product, but they have no idea how it actually got there. So it was,
I was thinking about that when I was driving, or I've been thinking about that, but particularly a little bit earlier today. I was on a long drive this morning, and I was thinking about questions and things like that with for you as an audio engineer, and what most audiophiles, your audiophiles talk about things, and when they're talking about these things about how sound is and how sound should be made and how transparent things are, and they don't want anything to mess with the sound, and they don't want tone controls, and I just they're very disconnected and have they don't have a good grasp of how music is made. By the time you get any piece of audio, I don't even if it's cut direct to record, it's gone through a trillion processes. It's gone through mixers and modulators and doohickeys and compressors and this is and that's is, and by the time you get it, the finished product has gone through so many things that that finished product is really a creation, not just on not just on the musician's part, but just as much on the engineer's part, or either the mastering engineer or the whole idea that we don't need tone controls and we don't DSP is bad and all these kinds of things. These are really misplaced issues that audiophiles have with this stuff, and I think it comes out of maybe they had bad experiences with some of those products in the past. Poorly implemented tone controls, poorly implemented DSP. Certainly, I know that's true for CDs. When CDs first came out, when it's a new technology, they didn't really understand how to mix those things, and they were trying to, you had analog guys mixing them the way they'd mix analog stuff, and they're just different. Can you speak about that a little bit? after
Yeah.
after you get done with your biography?
Yeah, sure. No problem, Thomas. And just staying on that theme, yeah. So at the time when I was in the studio, we were going through that exact process. So we're using state-of-the-art analog 24-track tape recorders, Studers, and such. And then all of a sudden there was this new machine that came in, and it's a 16-track digital recorder, and we're all kind of looking at it, trying to figure out how is
What do
this
I
going
do
to
here?
work, right?
Yeah.
And the big difference is that we couldn't believe it, like the dynamic range. I mean, I'm so used to hearing tape sound, tape noise. You get so used to it, the bass hump in the tape, and all sorts of stuff. The compression ratio that you can actually hit oversaturate the tape, and it has a particular kind of sound to it. It can round off the bass, or make the vocals more smooth. And so
Mm,
all of that's gone, right? So in
mm.
there's no such thing as slamming tape in the digital world. And so we were all kind of like, wow, it's so clean, man. Like we just couldn't believe it. And then
What
we
do I do with
startled.
this?
Yeah, exactly.
How do I get that same smooth voice now without slamming the tape? Because I can't overdrive digital, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we shocked ourselves a couple of times because we press roll on the tape, digital tape, and we're like listening. It's like we're not hearing anything. Turn up the volume, and all of a sudden, bam! There's the music, right? Because the background is so low that it just kind of surprises yourself. And so during that area, the early '80s and mid '80s, there were some absolutely fantastic digital recordings that came out. Peter Gabriel Security,
Mm,
uh, um, uh, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm trying to think of Dire Straits and a few others that knew how the engineers and masters knew how to, exercise and get the dynamic range out of it. And
mm,
so early on, we had some crappy recordings. And then once people started getting used to how to use it, we had some magnificent dynamic range recordings. And then, of course, everything changed by the time, the early 90s came about. And then in the mid 90s with Oasis album that went worldwide was also just slammed the heck out of the DR on that, had a
oh,
dynamic
yeah.
range of 6. And I think that was like in 1995, something like that was kind of the height or pinnacle of what's so-called the loudness wars. So anyways, it's a fascinating topic, and it is very interesting to see how music is recorded. And we're going to talk a little bit about that further in the presentation.
Yeah.
And just to step back a little bit and finish off the so by the time the 90s came around, there was a real kind of drop in the music industry, and so I was looking for something else to do. And during that time, I was studying programming languages on the Macintosh because people were bringing those into the studio and using sequencers and the like. And this is the kind of the first time that we were hearing digital kind of recorded MIDI kind of controlled music,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so
Programmed
programming,
drums. They would program the
exactly.
drums and everything, as opposed to me playing the drums like I have a drum set back there.
I
you
see
know.
that. Nice
Yeah.
set. I got one
Yeah.
in the basement too.
Oh,
Yeah,
do you? So, no programming drums.
that's
Programming
right.
drums bad.
That's bad. That's
Hire a real
bad.
drummer.
That's right. I was in a bookshop of all places, or a computer store in all places, and I was picking out these books. And one of the guys said to me, and he was the owner of the store, saying, "I see you in here a lot. What do you do?" And I said, "I'm in between jobs. Really like software." And he says, "Well, why don't you come work for us?" And so that was kind of the start of my
Oh wow.
software career. And then I actually went back to university and took software engineering in university and became a full-time programmer. So my day job over the last 20 years has been a software programmer, software architect, engineer, all those titles at various companies, including my own startup. I had a software company I started from scratch and eventually grew it to 25 people and sold that out.
Mhm.
And then I started working for some larger companies. I spent 5 years at Microsoft. I was one of the first guys that were using Windows Azure or Microsoft Azure, which was their cloud-based technology.
Mhm.
So I was an early adopter, and that was my role to help other companies early adopt by showing them how to program using the cloud. And from there, I just kept on
Wow.
going in that industry. Meanwhile, on the side, I had this audio passion, and as you pointed out, I've written a lot of material, reviews, books, that kind of thing. And I decided a year ago that, you know what, I love this so much that I want to do this full time. And so I opened up Accurate Sound, and after a year, so far so good. And I've got a few things to say about that towards the end of our talk. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Super, super. Now, you and I know we have a person in common. It's Majid Amir, and he's also a Microsoft alum, I guess. Did you guys' paths ever cross there?
No, I was there from 2010 to 2015 or 2016. I can't remember. So,
Okay, so
and
more
I think yours
recently.
are more recently. That's
Yeah.
right. And so just during the introduction of Windows Azure. So
Okay.
yeah, our paths didn't cross, even though I spent a great deal of time in Seattle and Redmond.
Yeah. You mentioned programming languages. What programming language become most proficient in? Probably like C plus or something like that. C plus plus.
So C Sharp was the programming language of choice
Okay.
for that duration. I'm currently programming in C++ because I'm writing a
Mhm.
DSP product that we'll talk about a little bit later. But
Okay.
yeah,
Awesome.
so yeah, mostly C Sharp. So that was kind of, and to a certain degree, most programming languages are the same. It's just the constructs that or sorry, the syntax that's different in most languages. But a
Mm.
for loop is a for loop, that kind of thing, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
even though at the time there was a lot of heated debate, very much like the audiophile debate about which one is better, kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So that's a funny. I have a funny aside about learning programming myself. Programming with Smalltalk. Are you familiar with
Oh,
Smalltalk? Even
absolutely.
old stuff, old school.
Oh man, that's awesome. That's the very first programming language I actually learned was Smalltalk. It's truly object oriented. That's the big deal about Smalltalk. And
Yeah.
the thing is that they used to say that you could put the entire syntax on just a Post-it card.
So Mitch, I'm gonna jump into the presentation because that's a big part of what we want to do here. Sure. Now, folks, what's going to happen here is Mitch is going to do a presentation for us about what accurate sound is. And so, Mitch, take it away.
Let her rip, right on, Thomas. Thanks.
Let her rip.
So,
Yeah.
what is accurate sound? So this is kind of a, I get this question asked a lot of me, and I think, I'm going to help kind of help people understand what it is that we're talking about with respect to accurate sound.
Hmm.
So you're sitting in your listening chair and you're listening to your speakers, and the idea is that you want the music that you're listening to arrive at your ears as closely as possible as what's on the recording. And so, putting into a different kind of context, we want to make sure that there's no frequency or timing response distortions arriving at our ears at the listening position. And so technically what we're talking about is a transfer function. And for a linear time invariant system, I'm not going to get into the gory details of what that means, but basically, the impulse response of the system, if you can send a pulse through the system and if you can record it at the other end and it's identical, that means you've reproduced that sound perfectly accurately. And so the reality is, unfortunately, is that speakers in rooms distort both the frequency and timing response in large and complex ways. And we're going to, the sort of meat of the talk is around that. What kind of distortions are we talking about?
Okay.
And then, we use kind of modern digital signal processing software. I'm powerful, modern, whatever you want to call it. is specifically designed to kind of reverse these distortions or minimize these distortions. And, you know, it's 2021. The digital signal processing software is incredibly powerful. We've got very powerful computers. And so the amount of resolution that we can fine tune our systems with is kind of, you know, I think going to be a bit of a shocker for most people. So, you know, when I talk about this stuff, I try and help people understand that, yeah, you know what, there is an ideal frequency response for a speaker. And I'm not talking about a speaker in a room yet. I'm just talking about the speaker. So here we have, I mean, it's a no-brainer, 20 to 20 kilohertz, plus or minus a minimal amount of tolerance. We can see it kind of droops a little bit in the bottom end. That's because, you know, speakers don't reproduce down to 0 hertz. They reproduce to maybe 20 hertz or lower if you have some subwoofers. So you're going to get some natural roll off from the speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm talking ideally here because I'm not showing that, you know, the speakers are not aligned in the individual drivers are not aligned in the cabinet. I'm not showing the distortions that the crossovers, passive crossovers introduce, and of course, not the room. Now, if I take you know, this same frequency response and I look at the timing response of this frequency response, and we usually use what's called a step response to show that. And the reason why we use a step response and not an impulse response is because an impulse response display is heavily weighted towards high frequencies. And so when people put up their impulse responses, they don't realize that what they're actually seeing is the high frequencies are typically 10 times greater in amplitude than mid-range frequencies and 100 times greater in amplitude than low frequencies.
I see.
And this is why we use the step response, is because it's equal. It shows the energy equally across the frequency band. And I've put in just a few kind of markers here to help people understand, you know, what it is that they're looking at. And so, you know, the horizontal scale here is in milliseconds. So 5, 10, 15 millisecond increments. And the vertical scale is just normalized from 0 to 100. And so, you know, before the sound arrives at your ears, there is a chance of what's called pre-ringing. And especially if you use some digital filtering, there's a possibility of some pre-ringing. We want to keep an eye on that. Then the vertical step itself, what that really means is that we're looking at a frequency range from 20 to 20 kilohertz as the vertical step. If there was any timing anomalies, such as, you know, the tweeter arriving before the woofer, for example, we would see that as an offset in the vertical response. So that tells us whether a speaker is time aligned or not.
So question for you,
Yes.
Mitch. Does this have anything to do with RT time, RT60 time?
No. So
Is that only in the acoustic space, and this is in the digital space? Is that the
Yes,
right way to look
that's
at it?
right. Yeah, that's the right way to look at it. I mean, the RT60 is the reverb time of the room,
Mhm.
and so the decay time or broadband decay time of the room.
Okay.
What we're looking at here is kind of at 0 milliseconds, where that's the sound arriving at our ears at the listening position. Even though I'm looking at an ideal timing response from a speaker, we can extrapolate that to the room.
Okay.
And then the low frequency roll off here, it may go further out or further in depending upon the actual roll off of your loudspeaker. So the lower the roll off, like let's say some of your subwoofers go down to 15 hertz, that means that the low frequency roll off the curve would kind of be out more to here. But
Is there an ideal shape that someone should be looking to achieve?
yeah, this is it, right? And
This is
so
it.
this is more or less the ideal shape. There's some variation on the amount of low frequency roll off, and as we'll see, you know, we're going to get into reflections, the low frequency room reflections, and this is one of the things that the issues that kind of, you know, destroys the clarity of the bass sound in your room,
So,
aside from the amplitude that we're going to talk about in just a second.
so all these, so and this these things with regard to the subwoofer and mid-range particularly have an effect on um, mid to high frequencies if these things are not right. Is that the right way to the effect of this, and or rather the benefit of getting this right is that everything in the higher frequencies can be heard, whereas your brain would um, what your brain would not pick them up as clearly if this is not optimal.
Yeah, you could sort of think of it that way, Thomas. I mean, really, what's happening here is what we want the sound from the speakers, both left and right channels, to be arriving at our ears at exactly the same time, or time zero on the chart.
Oh, okay.
Meaning both the subs, woofers, mid-range, and tweeters all at the same time. As we'll see, that's not normally the case. And then we'll also see that we're going to get some great big ripples down here as we get into the room reflections that are having its way on the signal and causing the distortion, not only in the frequency domain, but also the time domain.
Okay, gotcha.
Now, as soon as we drop a loudspeaker in a room, this is kind of the frequency response we're looking at, and this is quite typical of any speaker in any room. As you'll see that in the low frequencies down here, we get quite a starting up again and going back.
Yeah.
So we're looking at our loudspeaker in a room, and this is a typical response of a loudspeaker in a room. We're really kind of focused on the low frequencies down here. That's where we're interested in. And if we look at a zoomed in response, here I'm just looking at the low frequencies from 20 hertz to 1 kilohertz. And we can see that there's about 20 dB of sound pressure level variation between the peaks and the dips.
Yeah.
And so, that's very typical of what's called room modes or standing waves, typically below the room's transition frequency, which we'll get into in a moment. And it's unfortunately almost everyone's room has this problem, and the reason for that, as we'll soon find out, that below a certain frequency, the room is in charge of the low frequency response, not the loudspeakers.
Okay. So your room is acting kind of like your room is kind of acting like a resonator of sorts.
That's exactly it, as
Yeah,
a matter of fact.
like a Helmholtz resonator of sorts, right?
That's just like blowing on the top of a Coke bottle,
Yeah,
except
your
at
room is
lower
doing that.
frequencies. Your room is doing that, right?
Wow, yeah, that's
And
amazing.
so, yeah, and that's really troublesome. And so, this kind of slide kind of, and I pardon my spelling mistake there on frequency. It was late last night when I finished this. So,
No one will notice. It's all right.
so this is it, right? The below a certain frequency in your room, the room is in control, and above that, the loudspeaker is in control, and we call that frequency the transition or Schroeder frequency after the person that invented it many years ago. And typically in most rooms that we listen to sound in for living rooms or home theaters, that's anywhere from 100 hertz to 300 hertz, kind of in that range. And it takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around. The fact of the matter is that the room dimensions of your room determine not only the transition frequency, but also kind of the room modes that are in your room that there's not much you can do about except for digital signal processing and some acoustic treatment. Unfortunately, most acoustic treatment, unless they're diaphragmic absorbers, don't do much below 100 hertz to help control the room.
So these large bass traps and things of that nature that go into corners and things like that, would those be effective?
They're helpful, but not much so below 100 hertz. And so, just a small segue there. worked in a acoustical manufacturing and design company, and so we produced diffusers, bass traps, all sorts of
Hmm.
different types of traps, and extensively measured them in a variety of spaces, including anechoic chambers, to get their absorption coefficients, etc. And the one thing I learned when I mentioned earlier about working in the studio, I happened to work with Chips Davis, who invented the kind of the live end dead end studio. And the bass traps that they were using to absorb frequencies below 100 hertz, they were the size of the room. Like, they were the size of the back wall of the room and several feet deep.
Wow.
They also had an outer shell and an inner shell of the room where the really low frequencies just simply passed out the outer shell, got bounced around, and never made it back into the inner shell. And so, unless you're stuffing your room with 3-foot diameter tube traps, you're never going to be able to control these low frequencies like DSP can.
And
So,
that's partly to do with just straight the physics of how long a bass wave is. At 20 hertz, a bass wave is, I don't know, 15 feet or something, whatever the distance is. But in order to absorb that or half of that wave, you'd need something that thick
yeah,
to
absolutely.
suck that up, right? Isn't that the
That's
idea?
That is
Right.
the fundamental issue right there. And a
Yeah.
20 hertz wavelength is 56 feet. And so,
Okay. There you go. Yeah.
this is, and it's kind of hard to wrap the head around a little bit. But yeah, like I say, a 3-foot diameter tube bass trap isn't going to do a lot below 100 hertz. And so that's why we end up using DSP for that.
Oh, I see. Okay. So then, that's maybe good for some audiophiles because I think most audiophiles think of room correction or, however they call it, room mitigation or room treatment or whatever. They don't necessarily look to DSP, partly because of the conversation that we had earlier around DSP and audiophiles, misunderstand. Some of it is well placed. Some of them did have terrible tone controls. Some things are poorly
True.
implemented. So so
Very
that
true.
is accurate. That is accurate. They had deleterious effects because they were poorly implemented. But well engineered, well implemented tone controls should be transparent, save for their effect, their intended
Absolutely.
effect, save for their
Absolutely.
intended effect. And most audiophiles, I would imagine, think of room treatment as stuff you put in your room. And that's just a non-starter for most audiophiles, putting more stuff in their room. And you're saying here, this is a way that you don't have to do that necessarily. There's maybe a more effective way, at least below the Schroeder frequency, to handle that issue. And that's, I think, the that's the nugget for me because most audiophiles, at least old school audiophiles, think of room treatment, room whatever, as stuff in your room, physical things, and that's actually not the case below the Schroeder frequency. Not the most effective. Not the most effective, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, that's right. You totally got it, Thomas. Yeah, not the most effective. And don't get me wrong. I'm not against room treatment. I have room treatment in my room. You can see kind of a couple of panels up and over top of my shoulder there.
Hmm.
And so it's just enough broadband absorption to kind of bring down the overall decay time in the room so it isn't quite as lively. And it's changed over the years. It used to be, and when I was in the business, we went from really dead sounding rooms to, and I was talking about the live end dead end, which was kind of
Hmm.
a halfway in between. And then, nowadays, most living rooms as is has the right amount of reverberation time or broadband decay time. Unless your room is, incredibly bright with just open wall glass, that kind of thing, then it might be worthwhile to kind of dampen it down a bit. But the problem with overly damped rooms is that they suck the life out of the music. And
Hmm.
so that drove us nuts at the studio, and so we ended up ripping out. And a lot of people go through that phase where they buy a bunch of acoustic treatments, and then over time it just doesn't sound right, and they keep ripping it out, and eventually the balance comes back. And I think Floyd Toole goes into great detail about that in his book with respect to the liveliness in rooms. And I think, 300 to 600 milliseconds, in that range, if you will, that's a good range to shoot for as far as just, the decay time in a room.
I see. Okay.
So getting into more technical detail, I mean, here we're kind of looking at a binary kind of situation where, there's a dividing line where, the room's in control on one hand, and on the other hand, the loudspeaker's in control. In reality, it's, of course, like most things, it's a little bit more complex than that. And, I think this is really kind of important for people to kind of understand. And I won't get into the real gory detail here, but, there's actually 4 zones in our listening rooms. And, the zone, pressure zone here, where the frequency that has a wavelength of twice the longest length of the room, right? I mean, my room is, for example, 30 feet long, and double that is 60 feet. And at that stage, there's no more kind of influence of the room on the sound in the pressure zone. It's just static pressure. Above that, though, this is where we get into kind of the room modes, or the normal modes, or the standing waves. And until wavelengths are comparable to the dimensions of the room resonances and standing waves dominate. And until we get up into, what we talked about, which is the transition, or the Schroeder frequency. And so when you get the frequencies related to the exact dimensions of the room, that's when it resonates the most. And then after that, it is just, phase cancellations, some additions and some subtractions after that.
Mhm.
What people kind of fail to realize is that there's actually, once you're through the room modes, there's actually a diffusion zone, that where we're transitioning from waves into rays. And so, in the case of my room, the Schroeder frequency is about 100 hertz. And so by about 400 hertz is when the room is kind of done with having its effect on the wavelength of the sound. And so, that's typically 2 octaves above where your transition zone. And then
Mhm.
beyond that, this is where we get into where now sound behaves like rays of light bouncing around the room.
I see.
And,
Mhm.
and so this is where people unfortunately tend to put a lot of absorption, and they get this is where kind of the dead sound comes from. But the reason why I bring this up is because it's really important, because what we want to do when we're equalizing or using DSP, not only do we want to take out or smooth and mitigate the room resonances and standing waves, we also want a nice smooth transition from those standing waves into rays. And so, it just doesn't do good enough to, EQ below Schroeder. You need to EQ a little bit above that in order to get the smoothest kind of response in the room. And I'll show you how we do that using the DSP.
I see. So this is so yeah, so this is rays of, the way to characterize, or the way to visualize this, as you're saying, is rays of light, like rays of, like a flashlight, like a, you turn on a flashlight, a tight beam flashlight in a room, and that beam, bounces around. Let's just say, if you visualize that happening with sound above the diffusion, above that diffusion point, which is, looks like it's 4, 4 times,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's right.
4 times that, the shorter frequency. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is kind of the same thing as approximately 2 octaves above. So, and that's totally true. I mean, just imagine if your walls were mirrors and you shined a flashlight there, and it bounced all the way around the room. That's exactly kind of how the sound is going above that frequency, above 4 times the transition frequency in the room.
So so I think, I think it's important to point out is that the reason why the, audiophiles go for the thin, the 1 inch thick, type of, absorbers,
Absorption patterns.
yeah,
Yeah.
those absorptive patterns, they're easy to get, they're simple, they give you a sense of, oh, I'm doing something. But I think sometimes if you're not a keen audiophile and you understand what's happening, is that, because of these high frequencies, because their wavelengths are so short, that's the reason why those absorbers are effective, because if you can kind of, if you can kind of visualize it like your grandmother's heartbeat in the hospital, the thing, however the distance from the distance is how thick your thing, your absorber can be to absorb that whole that whole portion of the frequency. And so if you do that in the high end, you are absorbing all your high frequencies, so they're not getting to you as far as the reflection part. The direct sound is getting to you, but the reflections are not getting to you, causing your brain to kind of say, hey, this is something's not right here. This sounds dead. This is not natural, because it's spent millions of years as a finely tuned system, your ears and your brain understanding what's, this sense of space and all that kind of stuff. And to only get direct sound to your brain, that's really unnatural.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
very unnatural.
That's exactly it, Thomas. I think that's a great way of putting it. And if you look at stuff that tools written and others have written, it used to be that, first reflection points, and you need to bring it down, and all of this stuff, and there's some of validity to that, and kind of people's ears is kind of the ultimate test in the end of what you prefer. But yeah, it can, taking out the diffuse sound in the room with too much absorption really doesn't sound natural. And so that,
Mhm.
what also doesn't sound natural, but most people don't realize, is that it's these room modes and standing waves down here that's making the bass not only lumpy sounding, but not clear. And I'll show you why that is in just a second.
Yeah, I've had the biggest problem in my systems just over the years. Heck, I've had, I used to have a pair of Dunleavy. I don't know if you remember Dunleavy
Oh, yes.
SC5s. The
Beautiful.
Oh my God, I loved them. I don't get me started on that. I'll start crying. I had to sell them. I had to
Oh,
sell them, but
no.
yeah, yeah, it was a sad day, folks. It was a sad day. The Turner household. One day maybe I'll get them back, but I don't know. But anyway, they were amazing speakers, and they produced bass kind of regardless of where you put them in the room, because they had 412s in the room, so they energized the room like nobody's business. But there were
Yeah.
certain areas of the room where you could stand and it would like nearly take your breath away. If you're listening to Holtz, the Planets, or anything that was traditional stuff, or the 1812 overtures, any of that kind of stuff that had giant stuff. Um, or any of the stuff, the Star Wars, the original Star Wars soundtracks, any of that kind of stuff would just take your breath away. But in certain parts of the room, there was a massive drop off, and that was
Yeah.
really surprising.
Yeah.
That these huge monolithic speakers up to the ceiling, you could stand in one part of the room, but you move, a few feet, forward or back, and it was just certain things were more, 50 to 60 hertz were more emphasized, where a lot of popular music bass, a lot of popular music where the
Yes.
bass is in a 50, 60 hertz range. A lot of people think it's low bass. It's not really low bass. It's really more like mid bass, kind of. But those things would be accentuated, because that's where, you'd have room mode, or you'd have a huge dip. Yeah, so I've experienced it in my system, and it's been the most difficult thing to ring out. And DSP has been the only thing that has helped. I've used Dirac in the past, and I'm sure we'll get to some of that a little bit later.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've nailed it right on the head, and and that goes back to the point that the room is in control, not the loudspeaker below the transition frequency there.
Yeah, regardless of the cost of the speaker.
That's exactly right. Like
you know,
that's a scary bit, is that your room kind of determines the bass quality of your speaker, regardless of what you paid for that speaker.
yeah, and to a large degree, I think there's some research around, to a large degree, your preference for a speaker is, to a disproportionate degree, is in that bass, the mid to low, no mid to bass response.
That's
Um,
exactly right.
yeah, so that's very telling. You can spend all
Yeah.
the money in the world on speakers, but you may not be getting the performance out of them if you haven't paid any attention to your room.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the issue, and so, we're looking, kind of at a different view of the room modes from the previous diagram.
Mm.
And there's many of these room modes calculators online. AMROC is one of them. It's what I'm using here. It's really simple. You type in your dimensions of your room, and then it displays on a scale where the room modes are in your room. And what I really like about it, there's a couple of things. One is that if you hover the mouse cursor over each one of the nodes or room modes, and if your browser is hooked up to your stereo system and in the room, it is a fantastic way of listening to what room modes sound like in your room. It's a fascinating experience. They're all kind of different levels of Coke bottle, if you will.
What do you mean? It will play that
It will play that
output that
frequency.
frequency?
It will
Oh,
output that frequency as a sine wave. So
oh
that's,
wow.
yeah, so it's pretty
And
cool.
what
Keep the
website is
volume
that?
down.
What website is
AMROC,
that?
amrock.com,
Is
and
that AMROCK?
OC.com. Yeah.
OC
Yeah.
dot. So
Yeah.
amrock.com.
Yeah. So
I'm
it,
gonna put that in the description just so people can find it because I think that's very super useful.
yeah, I should have put it on there. I
Sure.
forgot. And
Okay.
and so what's kind of cool though is that like I say, you could keep the volume down initially. It's a kind of a shock when you hear these things resonate. It's like the whole room literally resonates. And so it's fascinating though because it trains your ears, right? It kind of helps your ears tune in, your ear brain tune in to what's actually going on in the room. And
Mm.
so there's, various other pieces of the graph. I think one of the things, if I look here at the bolt area, kind of a little bit to the bottom right there, there's kind of an odd kind of shape in there. And really what it is that there are, I'm not going to say preferred room ratios. I'm going to say there's room ratios that are better than others. And what that means is that the bass or the room modes or the standing waves are evenly distributed throughout the room. That gives yourself a better chance at getting some decent bass. And so if your room ratio falls within this bolt area, that means you've got a chance of getting some decent bass response out of your room. The other kind of really cool view is they have this room 3D view. And so here I've hovered the cursor. Just want to check if you're still there, Thomas.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, good, because
Yep.
I can't see my internet connection, and just want to make sure it hasn't gone down.
Yeah.
So here I'm at 71 or 72 hertz, and if you look at the diagram, you can see that there's two big axial modes, and if I moved the cursor down to 35 hertz, then we would see this red tier or resonant or standing wave disappear. And
Oh.
so every time you hover over one of these modes, the display changes so that you can actually see, where it is in the room that's actually resonating. And then you can go stand in those areas. Of course, as it turns out, we have a tendency to put speakers in corners
Yeah.
and
Right.
in the very places that where we're going to get some of that room mode and some of that resonance. And I put off to the side here, I just, again, we talked about it a little bit earlier, just so that people can get an idea of the wavelengths that we're talking about. People get all hung up about where the direction of the sound is coming from and all that good stuff. Really, people should be thinking about wavelengths. This is the key to kind of understanding what's going on in the room, where, the wavelengths are so large that, and below transition frequency, we've got waves in the room, resonances, standing waves. And then above that transition frequency, we start getting into, diffusion zone. And we see that the waves are actually smaller and smaller. And then, by about 500 hertz, we're talking about, a wavelength of just over 2 feet. And so this is kind of, again, to help visualize and understand, what's actually going on inside a room.
Why does it jump there at so in from 500 to 1280 this is the diffusion zone that you're referring to.
Yeah, and
Is that right?
notice the scale's turned into inches though. So that's 27 inches, not 27 feet.
Okay,
So,
gotcha. Okay, gotcha,
yeah,
right, okay.
it's kind of small there. So that's why the jump. Yeah.
Sorry, folks, that was me. I'm being boneheaded.
It's all good. I first looked at that too when I was looking at the charts, going, "Wait a minute, that's not right." And I go, "Oh yeah, inches, yeah." So, and it's not only that we have to worry about the dang room, where we've got all these room modes and issues. We've also got to worry about where the heck we're putting the speaker, where the listening position is, and we get effects like speaker boundary interference, where depending on where the speaker is against the back wall, we've got the low frequency bouncing off the back wall, along with the direct sound being the reflected sound. Depending on where you sit, it could produce a deep null like we see here, or it can accentuate the low end. There's a number of good sites that have speaker boundary interference calculators and the like. But what I'm trying to point out here is that it's complicated. There's so many factors of positioning speakers in room and the listening position and the interference patterns on top of the fact that we've got room modes.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
then finally, and then we get to our ears, right? And we find out that our ears are nonlinear too. And so, our frequency response varies with sound pressure level. And so at low listening levels, we can hear more of the mid range, and the low end and the top end kind of drop out. And then at higher listening levels, it's the lows and the highs sound a lot more prominent, but the mid range is comparatively softer.
Wow.
And so this is an issue. We were talking about kind of the industry guidelines,
Hmm.
and that's all available right now. There's no body of certification anymore, which was kind of like who was producing the best sound and the best mixes. And
Oh.
so we've got these industry guidelines, and what's interesting about these guidelines is that they specify you could take one of these and build a studio control room or a mastering facility or what have you, because it gives all the specifications around, and I've got a kind of a précis of that here.
Mm.
What is the in-room frequency response supposed to look like, plus or minus how many dB? What the reference listening level was. We just talked about that, right?
Hmm.
77 dB to 83 dB SPL. What the reverberation time specification is. They even have a stereo listening configuration. And
Wow.
what's kind of funny is that almost all mixes, masters are done in an equilateral triangle. That's what's going to give you the best stereo image. So for playback, if you want the most accurate sound, that's what you would do. You would set up your system so that it's an equilateral triangle, for example.
And that's kind of funny because if you look at, there's many speaker manufacturers that have their own, their own, their own set of how you're supposed to set up their speakers, and they don't all use this standard. Wilson has theirs. Audio Physics, I believe, has theirs. A lot of different companies have their own take on it, and I don't know how scientifically um, vetted those techniques are, or if the company just says, "Hey, we set them up and they sound really good in our room, and we want to give our customers some guidelines. So here's what we have," but they're not necessarily using some kind of objective measure to come up with those that I know of. Each of those companies is pretty different. The Wilson method's the WASP method is different than the audio physics method, and you know, um, uh, uh, Jim Smith of Get Better Sound has his own method. So this it's much different than these. It's not the equilateral the triangle thing though.
Yeah, exactly. And I can't speculate for why that is or why the industry had changes like that. I think that what's interesting is that the fact that all of the mixes and masters that we generally listen to are indeed mixed in an equilateral triangle. So if you're trying to get the right stereo image, it's kind of an irony, isn't it?
Yeah,
That you'd want to set it up the same way that was more or less set up in the studio, right, and the
as much as
control room.
possible.
So
Yeah, as much as
um,
possible. Anyway, yeah.
as much as possible, and so that's what I do. I mean, of course, all my setups are this way, and so when I mix something at the studio, when I used to do that kind of work, and I would bring it home and listen to it, the stereo image was exactly the way that I had placed it in the mix. And
Mm.
so, of course, you're distorting that when you have your speakers set up in a different way. But if you're not after accurate sound or a real reproduction of what you're trying to hear from the studio, then yeah, anything goes, right?
Well, it does, but it's kind of odd that audiophiles, that would be what they're doing mostly, is anathema to high fidelity and accurate sound. Many audiophiles, in other words, what they say they want and what they do are different. They say audiophiles being high fidelity. It's the whole hobby is high fidelity audio. Um,
Exactly.
and in order to get that, these are the things you do. But oftentimes in this space, uh, audiophiles kind of take a very different approach than the science tells us to do.
Correct. That's exactly right. And I can't really speculate why that is, but it is different. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So, I think, I just want to turn our attention to, like, we kind of get a background of, acoustics, of room reflections, of room modes, the diffusion zone. Our ears hear differently at different sound pressure levels. And there's industry standards, guidelines that you can use to set up your system, kind of like it was in the studio, for example. And then, we transition to, the problem domain now into kind of the solution domain. And so, we're looking at some modern DSP for loudspeakers in rooms. And I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the, topics that I've got listed here,
Hmm.
and get into kind of the details. One of the many advancements in audio DSP over the years is that there's kind of two types: hardware-based DSP that you would find in, AVRs or pre-pros, and then
Hmm.
software computer-based DSP. And there is a difference between the two, and you do want to know the difference. And when I use the term, finite impulse response and filter taps and all of these technical terms,
Hmm.
the only thing that you really need to know is that, in a hardware-based DSP, you've only got, typically 4,096, taps, whereas in software, you get like 65,000 taps.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
that gives you a lot more power to filter the lowest frequencies than you can with any hardware-based DSP. If you work out the math, it really means that you've only got two EQ points, two equalizers, if you will, below 100 hertz, and that's definitely not enough to deal with room modes in the room. So, software
Wow.
computer-based DSP has a full advantage over anything hardware, and that's currently the limitation of any hardware DSP system today.
Now, when you say the hardware DSP, do you mean things like something that would be baked into like a mini DSP module, something like that, or
Correct.
something like that? Okay.
Odyssey, Mini DSP, Trinov, Storm
Okay.
Audio. I mean, all of these, you know, they have other functions, of course,
Sure.
and typically what they're more marketed for, room correction is not the best in these devices. That's the fundamental issue. If you really want state-of-the-art room correction, you need to be in a computer-based system. And then there's variances between the types of DSP. We want to use DSP that corrects both the frequency and the time domain in order to get that complete transfer function. In almost all hardware-based DSP, there is no time domain correction, and so you're only getting kind of half the
Ah,
transfer function is only being fixed
I
and
see.
or adjusted.
Now, how would the audiophile shopper consumer know if there's a time domain function correction in a hardware-based DSP product? Do they specifically call that out? Is that a selling point, or is that a feature, or
Yeah,
do they kind of uh, just don't say it and hope that people just don't know? Or
well, they don't say it in the case of hardware-based DSP. It's only in software-based DSP, and it's only through education, right? That an investigation of what these software or hardware-based DSPs can do. And
mm,
so this is kind of just a very small snapshot of the differences, but they're the main ones. And I wanted to point out
Yeah.
that, if you're serious about getting, into room correction or digital signal processing to help fix the room modes, etc., in your room, you really need a computer-based system to do so.
I see. So that's not necessarily though a computer audio play. Well, I guess it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a computer audio player, but you do need to have you do need to have a computer, or rather it's preferable to have a computer that you run your audio through, and then you can run it out of that computer into some other audio player or whatever. Or you could have an audio player into the computer as well that hosted a VST or something like that. I have Arivana, and I know it hosts VST. I think I know you use JRiver, and that hosts VSTs as well. And that would be an example of the software-based DSP with this with the the ideal solution, or not the ideal solution, but a solution, one of the solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's two parts to the kind of the DSP. There's the design, the analysis and design of the filters, and then there's the runtime version or the host of those filters in a runtime situation. And so
Okay.
they're typically hosted in what's called a convolver. So they
Okay.
use convolution to convolve the correction filter with the music passing through, which therefore equals kind of the accurate sound that you're going to hear at your ears.
Mhm.
And so for sure, you can have a separate convolver running on a computer and feed in whatever you want through that, and then out to your speakers. So
Okay, so that clears it up for me, because I was for so long I had a hard time just mentally separating them out. Now that this gives me a much better picture and understanding now, okay, I can just have a computer, just if I'm just conceptualizing it, I can have a computer, or maybe even a Raspberry Pi, one of the newest one anyway, maybe even a Raspberry Pi, just running my audio through it for the convolver piece
correct.
specifically, and then I can run it out to whatever other device I want to as a player.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. And even, if we get a network attached solution or a DLNA, then it just becomes an endpoint that you can run stuff through. So there is a
Wow.
variety of ways it can be done.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's typically that there's a kind of a design time piece and a runtime piece. And the
Okay.
convolver is the runtime piece that hosts the digital filtering that's been analyzed and designed.
Wow. Okay.
And so, just to walk through some of the basic steps of room correction. So, you know, um, you got to, have a measurement microphone and a way to kind of measure the speakers. So, and whether it's single or multiple measurements, we'll get into that in a second. Um, you filter the measurement, and I'm not going to go really too deep here, but there is some psychoacoustic filtering going on and frequency dependent windowing, and I will talk about that in a second. And we're also separating the minimum phase response from the excess phase response. So this is where it gets really technical. And, John Mulcahy over there at REW has produced a paper on what a minimum phase system is. Speakers are, the ideal speaker is a minimum phase device. However, when you drop it into a room, you've got crossovers and the room modes. There are areas in the room and in the frequency response that are no longer minimum phase. They're mixed phase, or excess phase is typically what we call it.
Hmm.
And so, there's two pieces to the correction. There's actually correcting the frequency response, which also corrects the phase response for the minimum phase piece. But then there's excess phase, typically at low frequencies. These are the reflections that are getting into the sound and giving the bass what I call non-clear bass. It sounds kind of amorphic or a blob. It doesn't sound focused and clean and clear and distinct in the mix.
Is this what
So
some people call muddy? Muddy, kind
totally,
of flabby or
totally.
loose. Okay. That kind of droning on kind of bass that the note just,
Resonance,
yeah.
one note bass, you
Yeah,
bet.
there you go.
There's all sorts of names for it. And so the idea is you draw a target response or a house curve or one of those operational room responses, whether it's a partial or full range correction. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then the software typically inverts the minimum phase response. And I referenced John's paper. I should have put the link in there, but anyone can look up REW minimum phase, and that'll pop up right away. And then you determine how much excess phase correction is required. And you're using what's called frequency dependent windowing. And what that means is that when we're analyzing the sound in the room, because of the long wavelengths at low frequencies, we have to open up the time window, the amount of time that the microphone is taking in the test signal for a good period of time. So like 3/4 of a second, for example. And so for that 3/4 of a second, with all those wavelengths bouncing around in the room, where it's coming into the microphone. As the frequency is going up, we're using less and less. We're closing the window down so that by the time we get past the Schroeder frequency and by the time we get past the diffusion zone that we talked about, we're only EQing just the direct sound coming off of the speaker. And just broadly, you know, there's a lot of discussion about you know, whether I want to do a full range or a partial range correction. And there's merits to both. And again, the most important part is just taking care of the bass response. I like sometimes full range corrections because most speakers I find are too bright. So I want to be able to tone that down a bit.
I
So,
see.
right? And so, and I'll speak to more of that in a minute. And then, of course, you generate these filters and you package them up to be placed into JRiver or Roon or HQ Player or standalone Convolver, what have you. And then you install the filters and you're listening, and then you're kind of determining your preference. And when I say determine preference, I usually mean tonal response. And so, you know, some people like a little brighter sound, some people like a little duller sound. There is such a thing as preference. So there, you can be technically correct and still have a preference. So you don't have to be, you know, totally by the book here. And you'll find that, you know, and then people ask me, well, do I have different correction filters for different styles of music, etc.? And it's like, you know, if it was mixed and mastered properly, like we talked about previously, that'll all sound good across your system. I only have one filter that I use, and I listen to everything through it, whether it's music, movies, just, you know, news, whatever that's coming through. It all goes through the same filter.
I see.
So, you know, now we're going to get into some really technical stuff, and you know, this is what separates the quality of the DSP and the room systems, room correction systems. You know, here I'm looking at Accurate as one of the DSP packages. It's I would rate it fairly high. The trace you see in red, that's the actual room response. That's the measurement of the room. But the green trace, that's actually a new response that the DSP software is now going to use to produce a correction. And there's a couple things to note about it very closely here. As you can see, just below 100 hertz or even at 100 hertz, there's these really sharp, narrow dips, but you can see that we're not going to fill those in with the room correction software. And there is a reason for that. That's what's called overcorrection, number one. And number two, those narrow dips, our ears really don't hear those. They're so narrow in bandwidth that they're narrower than our ears can discriminate. And so our brain just kind of fills it in. So there's no point in applying room correction to that. As we move up in frequency, you can see we're kind of riding high, or what's called the envelope of the curve. That's what our ears tend to hear more so than all of the hash that you see in the response. We tend to follow the peaks of the frequency response. That's what gives it, you know, the sound the way it sounds. Not so much the dips, but more the peaks.
So if so long as the gap is not large,
that's correct.
It's not a big Q.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And so the you know, we just want to make sure that we are filling in some of it, but not all of it. And the really good systems, by the way, they always cut, they never boost. So the filtering is always cutting frequencies. It's never boosting any frequencies above 0 dB or reference level, so to speak. So that's a little bit different than your parametric equalizers where you can boost frequencies.
Mm,
And those have kind of some side effects as well. And we can go down into gory detail about it, but really there's, the quality of these digital signal processing systems are really based on, the care that was taken into and the understanding of the psychoacoustics and the filtering that's being used, and properly used, because it's both an art and a science, right? And so we know all about the physics of the room and how sound travels and all that. And the art piece is like, well, how much of it do I want to correct, and based on what parameters?
I see.
And so that gets into kind of, when I talked about frequency dependent windowing, this bottom scale, so that red trace there, that's the impulse response of the room, for example. And so that's 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, 150. So, when we talk about wavelengths, we're talking about cycles. And at 15 cycles for a 20 hertz wavelength, that means that the window, as you can see, is open for about 750 milliseconds. And so at 20 hertz, all the sound waves bouncing around the room are coming into the microphone and going to be used to correct those frequencies, because we're talking about room resonances and room modes. But as we move up in frequency, so you can see at 100 hertz, that we're only correcting about 100 milliseconds of sound travel in the room.
Mm,
So we're kind of discriminating the difference between low frequencies and high frequencies, or mid frequencies to high frequencies. And this goes back to that diagram that I was showing earlier that showed the 4 different zones. And so we want a lot of correction. We need a lot of correction in that zone that is where the room modes, the standing waves are, where those great big dips and peaks in the response. We want to make sure that's inside the window length or the window
right.
width, so that they're being corrected.
Mhm.
As we move up in frequency, we don't want as much sound corrected. And then in fact, by the time we get to 1 kilohertz here, we're only seeing about 1 millisecond of window that's opened. That means that it's only the direct sound above that that's going to be corrected, not any of the room reflections. And
I
so
see.
that's a really important concept for people to kind of wrap their heads around, and what to look for in modern DSP software. Frequency dependent windowing is an absolute must in order for it to sound right.
Yeah,
Uh,
this
so
is totally new to me. This piece here, I've only seen it before in conversations, but I never really understood it until today. Now it makes perfect sense that you need to be able to mitigate these issues within that window. Otherwise, it's not effective at this frequency. But it's specifically at what frequency. This is the key. Is at what frequency is it doing what it's doing? So if you're out there shopping for a DSP product, this is important to know.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And so we're going to kind of see that in action. And I'm just have a small segue here. People think that there's all these tests on the internet saying that, oh, I can't hear time delay, or I can't hear when something's delayed by X amount, etc. Part of the reason is that you need to train your ears and you need to know what to listen for. And so this is a great example of what's called the Hawes effect in use, and you can grab a set of headphones. And so, when we're talking about where there's an offset between the main speaker and the sub, and the offset may be 3 milliseconds, and people say, well, I can't hear that. Well, you absolutely can. You just need to train your ears. And this is a great video that I found on the internet that gives a great example of where someone is playing a track, an organ track, and then adding a delay to it.
Mm,
And 3 millisecond delay is roughly about 3 feet. Sound travels about a foot per millisecond. And so, when you listen to it in your headphones, it's like, oh, wow, yeah, I can hear that distinctly. And
Wow.
so this is kind of a way to train your ears so that when you listen to your stereo and you can start hearing when things are arriving, the time delays that are involved. It takes some time to tune into it. It's not as dramatic as frequency response changes, but it's definitely there. And, I used it all the time when I was in the studio. Of course, in studios, it's not a live environment. And so we're trying to make it sound like, or paint the picture of that, hey, this rock band is at the concert hall. I can add digital delay, I can add reverb, etc.,
I
to
see.
give it
Right.
the sense of big space and depth.
Yeah.
And so it's again tricking the ears to believing that, you know, it sounds like I'm in at the concert, but when you actually physically look at the picture, it's the guitar player huddled over, sitting on top of his amplifier in the studio in a little booth,
Yeah, right.
trying
Yeah.
to get his notes correct on the
Yeah.
recording.
It's I like AC/DC, and I like a lot of rock stuff, old rock stuff. And some of those rock bands back in the day, I mean, even today, I would imagine that, a common thing is where, the bands don't all, AC/DC doesn't do this. From my understanding, they play everything a million takes, and they do it, right there.
Live
There's
off
none of
the
this.
floor.
Yeah, they practice that way, they play that way still to this day. There's none of this phone it in, "Hey, I'm in my mansion. I go to my recording studio in the back there, and I lay down my track. Bob lays down his track in his mansion, and lays down the vocals somewhere else, and then they send it all to an engineer, and the engineer puts it all together." That's kinda what you're talking about
Yeah,
in
that's
some
right.
cases.
And yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm a big fan of recording live off the floor. I've gotten some of my best takes in the studio doing that. In fact, I've
Oh,
done
okay.
that just, getting the band to warm up, and they don't know it, but I'm recording, so
Oh,
that
wow.
they, they're not thinking about, it's recording. It's like,
Is
oh, I'm
this
just trying to
right?
get I'm trying to get exactly. I'm just playing my tune, right?
Do you think there's a problem? Do you know Rick Beto? Have you seen him on YouTube? Rick Beto?
Doesn't ring a bell at the moment.
He's a really good musician. He has a really popular YouTube channel, but he talks a lot about this perfection in audio production these days, which is just too much. And I want to go back to the days of, you don't have to be, audio is not about perfection. Because,
That's right.
in this day and age, there's so much algorithms with how many beats per minute this is. And the record companies know down to the nth degree what's popular, what's going to sell. So you have music these days and everything sounds the same.
Yeah,
It's produced the same. It all sounds the same. It's almost like you could turn on any radio station and you can hear essentially the same three or four or five chords in the same, in an almost a very similar progression, maybe mixed up a little bit. But there's some audio is about imperfection too. Someone
absolutely.
not hitting the chord exactly right, and that in and of itself is beautiful.
Yeah,
you know,
I agree. I
the
miss live
variation.
performances. Man, do I miss live performances. I
Yeah,
mean, it just, that was one of our favorite treats. There's as a side note, in Vancouver, there's a famous club called the Commodore Ballroom, and
I've heard of it. I've
yeah,
heard of
it
it.
brings bands from all over the world. And so, my better half and I would travel there a lot to hear live music, always with
Wow.
earplugs.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
But
yeah, of course, exactly. Yeah, protect your ears. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, and
Because if you don't protect them, no one else will.
that's exactly right. And so I've measured like 110 dB at some of these
Oh
clubs. I mean,
God,
even with earplugs in, I can feel the pressure, and it's just like, wow,
you're
but
killing your
nonetheless,
ears.
yeah. But I love the band, like the energy, the live sound, the crowd, the lights, the
You
sound. It's
can't. Yeah,
great, right?
there's no way to replace that. Yeah.
There's no way to replace that. So, anyways, that was just a small aside there. And so we get into things where, well, what target do I use? How do I, that kind of thing. And you know, um, Sean Olive has did a
Yeah.
study on room correction, and here we see kind of like that downward sloping, tilting response. You'll see that in the operational room response curves that I showed earlier. It's part of the standards. Some of those could be updated a little bit. There's some newer information about this, but it gives you an idea of some uh, um, blind testing and what people's preferred response is. And, here you can see that the most preferred room correction is still better than just the unequalized speaker. It comes down to kind of a bit of a preference thing. I typically lift up and down the 20 kilohertz marker by 1 or 2, 3 dB, and I kind of what is termed in the photography world is bracketing. So I'll have a number of responses, and I'll bracket and listen and switch between them and find the one that I like kind of the most preferred. And it takes a little bit of time and tuning, but when you kind of nail it, every piece of music that I listen to, regardless of genre or whatever, it all sounds right. It sounds like
Right.
the right level of balance between top and bottom. Of course, there's variances, and of course, there's variances in studios. Some recordings don't have enough bottom end, some have too much bottom end. But generally speaking, within the range, I don't find I have to reach for a tone control on anything. And I listen to stuff from the 30s all the way up to, modern day.
Wow.
So, and again, one of the things I wanted to point out here as well is that, a tilted frequency response is perceived as flat. So if you look really closely here, you can see it was the previous graph, and you can see that it's that tilted response. To our ears, it's perceived as flat at the listening position. So this is something that, people kind of need to take into consideration, because some measurement systems. You still there, Thomas?
Yes. Oh yeah, I'm still
Oh,
here.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm freaking out because I keep losing my internet connection, but I'm good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
some room response systems, I won't name them, but they will EQ your speaker flat at the listening position, and it's way too bright. I mean, it's just simply too bright, and so it kind of defeats the purpose. And as Sean and team has come to the conclusion, flat in-room response is not the preferred target. The preferred target is kind of a downward tilting response that gives the right blend to our ears, perceived to our ears as being the right balance, the right mix. So, to give a couple of examples of that, earlier on I showed that frequency response rate at the very beginning of a person's system. And then after digital room correction, we can see that we've really tightened up the response. In this case, it was a full range correction, but it's really tightened up the response. I mean, it literally is plus or minus 3 dB across the entire frequency window, all the way down to, in the case of these speakers, it was down to 14 hertz or so. And so, and then when you switch the filter in and out, of course, it's going to make a big difference, right? And it doesn't take long to come to the conclusion that, wow, this sounds way better than the lumpy response that I got before. And beyond the diffusion zone, if you will, it's a matter of taste, as to how much high frequency response you want coming at your ears, and so you can adjust the tilt accordingly. I know there's a lot of argument online about, oh, should you EQ full range or just up to Schroeder? And as we've learned today, you need to go past Schroeder in order to get that diffusion zone in there.
So the transition point is the important piece in that, in the reason, in the justification for EQing past the Schroeder.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a switch. It just doesn't turn off or on.
Right.
The wavelengths eventually become small enough so that the room doesn't have an effect, and you want to make sure that you've got a little bit of that tuned in as well.
I see. Now, do you find that some people, when they get this response on the right, the ideal response, that they have to get used to that clarity, that resolution, that transparency, because now you're hearing more, so you're hearing more of the music. Have you found that to be an issue with people that you've worked with?
For some folks, initially, it's like it can be, So when I actually produce some of these filters, I typically follow the speaker's response, natural response out of the gate, and that isn't much of a, it isn't a huge leap between unfiltered and filtered response, but for sure they're really surprised to hear, hey, I've never heard that vocal like that before, or I've never heard the bass, sound that way before. And I'm so used to a different sound, so it does take a little bit of time to kind of acclimatize to hearing it like it should.
Mhm.
And, it really begs the question of, how many people have actually heard like real solid, smooth based response that they can actually say and show objectively that they're listening to that in their
Yeah.
room. And it's kind of a bit of a tragedy in my mind, in the sense that it's so easy to fix
Yeah.
that why wouldn't you want that, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, I think
it,
Vinny, I
it's
think Vinny,
interesting.
I think it's a DSP bias. And it's hard to make the jump for them because the digital has such a negative connotation to it that I don't want anything done to my music. I don't want anything touching my music. I don't want anything. I don't want to stack DACs or anything like that. You could stack 10 DACs, and if they're all transparent, you would have no clue.
Yeah, I know. It's tough. It's
you
tough
know.
sometimes to come over that kind of bias, for sure. And I've been there myself. And admittedly, there are some really crappy DSP systems out there,
Yeah.
not only long ago, but still today. There are
Oh
some
wow.
just, unfortunately, and we see kind of YouTube videos where people are showing off and on access response using
Oh
crappy
yeah.
DSP systems, and
I've
then
seen those.
blaming the DSP when it's like, A, they're not quite sure how they're using it, and B, you've got the wrong tool for the job, I'm afraid, is,
Yeah.
is the bottom line, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just making a quick transition between, the timing response before and after DSP. This is where I think, um, one of the biggest gains in modern DSP is applied, and it's not quite in the way that people think. So, this impulse response on the left, or step response on the left, that's the uncorrected speaker. And if you look really closely, you can see kind of a really narrow spike. That's the tweeter arriving first, and then you can see a bigger spike. That's the woofer arriving second. So
Oh.
aside from time alignment, there's also, this very funny looking response in the room. And what's interesting about it is that both speakers are not in time with each other. And
Uh,
so one speaker's got a kind of a peak at a certain time, and the other speaker's got a dip at a certain time. And this is the direct result of why bass does not sound clear in the room. It's one thing to get the bass even, meaning an even frequency response, but it's another thing entirely in order to make it sound clear.
I
And
see.
so this is why when we look at the impulse response on the right, if you remember our ideal impulse response, or ideal step response, I should say, it looks exactly like that. In fact, you
Mhm.
can kind of see the target in behind superimposed on the blue and red traces. And so, if you think about it a little bit of what's actually going on here, in the previous frequency response that I showed, you'll see that, at the one speaker there's a big peak, and the other speaker is a bit of a dip. And so you get this uneven stereo image that's happening, not only the direct sound, but also the reflected sound
I
at
see.
low frequencies. And so when the sound is arriving at your ears, and the frequency and arriving at your ears at exactly the same time on both channels, plus the frequency response is the same on both channels, plus the timing response over time in the room is for the same channels, this is where you get the ultimate listening experience of not only a smooth, flat, even response, but you get that stereo, not only the stereo image, but I perceive one of the biggest differences is the depth of field. All of a sudden, now the depth of the recording is showing through. That is the same kind of size and image that I'm getting from the width and the height of the stereo image. I'm now getting that depth of field. And this is where we can make, great gains using DSP, is to make sure that we're getting the accurate sound, meaning that there's no timing and frequency response distortions. And in this case, from a timing perspective, in the low frequencies over time. So
I
when
see.
the sound's still bouncing around the room, we're making sure that it's trying to track to the ideal minimum phase response.
Right, right, right. Wow, yeah.
And here's another example of what I'm talking about, that exact same thing. So these are my JBLs and sitting in my room here, and I wanted to kind of show a measurement of the speaker, not only the frequency response, but the phase response as well, or timing response, another view of the timing response. But I applied no smoothing. So there's no, 1/12 octave smoothing or anything like that. And also it's the default window in REW. So 500 millisecond window. So what that means is I'm letting in all of the sound in the room into the microphone over a half a second. And as we can see with DSP correction and tuning, what I've done is ensured that those low frequencies, not only are they smooth, but the timing is perfect, meaning that there is no low frequency reflections coming in to make the bass not sound clear. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the Schroeder frequency or transition frequency in my room is at 100 hertz. And then I've adjusted the frequency dependent window so that by the time, we get past the transition zone or the diffusion zone, which is up around 400 hertz, I'm starting to let the room reflections in to give it the natural sound. And this is an example of a perfectly properly tuned room for low frequency response. So it doesn't sound unnatural in the top end because I've got all the room reflections are still coming in and giving that sense of spaciousness and warm sound. But in the bottom end, not only is it super solid, it is super clear. The clarity in the mix where I can point literally in the 3D space and say the bass player's right here. I can hear every note articulate. The drums, when they hit, I know where the kick drum is. I know where the tom-toms are. They're perfectly placed in a three-dimensional space and have that impact that doesn't sound like it's blurring, or it doesn't sound like it's kind of like amorphic. It doesn't sound solid and tight. And and as the frequency changes, I can't, all of a sudden the bass kind of sounds a little bit off center and then it's on center again. All of those things are gone when you, apply a proper digital signal processing correction to a room.
Wow. That's a big, yeah, that's very stark.
Yeah, it makes a difference. And, it's just not for in-room speakers as well. Here I've got an example, yet another article that will be published on AUDIOPHILE Style over there at Chris's site in the next week or so. I had some desktop speakers, and those are even harder sometimes to equalize properly than your home stereo speakers. And the reason being is the desk. The desk gets in the way. The moment you drop those speakers on the desk, the moment they start sounding like boom boxes. And so, and you can see here on the left, the red response is the corrected response, and the blue response is the measured response of the speakers. And you can see that 125 hertz, there's like a good 10 dB peak there that gives it that one note bass sound. And, it's almost unlistenable. The peaks here at 300 and 500 hertz, they typically, and that's the diffusion zone I'm talking about, they typically have a boxy sound. They give it a really kind of like nasally boxy sound along with the one note bass. And that's why people don't have desktop speakers, because they typically sound terrible when you put them on the desktop for these exact reasons.
Yeah, one of the things that I have been very interested in is to take all this information and be able to relating those graphs to how that would affect the listener. And
Yes.
so, unless you're an engineer, and most
Yes.
audiophiles are not engineers.
Yes,
And-
and I think that would be a great guide, and there are some out there that have a little bit of that. I mean, in Bob Katz's mastering book, he's got a kind of the both the frequency response range and the subjective terms that kind of go with, if it's this frequency range, it's a little too much of X, and if it's deficient, so there's a few of them, but totally agree, Thomas, they're far and few between, and that's the thing. it's directly relatable. It's directly correlated, and it doesn't actually take too long to kind of figure it out to a certain degree. I mean, you can take a graphic equalizer or a parametric EQ and just play with it, just boost and cut frequencies along the frequency band, and you'd be like, "Ooh, that's really sharp to the ear. What frequency range is that? Oh, that happens to be where our ears are the most sensitive at 2.5
Mm.
kilohertz. That's why it sounds like it's a drill going into my ear at that frequency range." So
Right.
it's notorious today. I mean, it's so funny in the sales of speakers, like they keep getting brighter and brighter on the showroom floor to make it sound like, wow, they're kind of like really kind of thinking that's high fidelity. But you can even see in my response here that the corrector response, I started dropping the top end,
All right.
around 6 kilohertz, a little too bright for my ears. I mean, I'm an older guy. I've got
Yeah.
tinnitus,
Okay.
from all those years working in studios and stuff. I've tried to protect my ears as best as I can,
Yeah.
but it's just a fact of life over time, and some loud sounds. Fortunately, they're still perfectly balanced and still hear quite well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you get more sensitive, I think, as you get older to high frequencies. Some people, they kind of make the reverse mistake. Well, when you get older, they want to crank up the high frequencies. It's like, no, no, no.
Oh,
It's
you want to.
already too bright. It is, man. It's like,
I
you got to
see.
turn that down.
So, the funny thing is I see that the frequency response, most guys are thinking about, okay, I wanted this to be flat because that would indicate to me that flat means unadulterated. Flat means not touched, right? And so they're kind of still using that same thought process of no tone controls, no DSP, raw music.
Yeah. And as
And
we
so it's hard,
know,
hard to get audio files out of that idea. I thought that, anything messing with their signal.
yeah, well, I mean, and as it turns out, and because of the digital signal processing, I mean, part of the irony is that there's DSP going on in every DAC that's
Yeah.
out there on the market to a certain degree, and various other filtering at various stages, even in your playback system, regardless of how it was recorded.
Yeah, there's error correction. There's all kinds of shenanigans going on with your audio before from the time you push play and
That's
in a
right.
digital playback system, there's umpteen digital, filters and processes happening that are before it gets to the output of your speaker, to your speakers, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
to just to follow on the right hand step response, we can see. I mean, these desktops, they were iLoud NTMs, by the way, are actually pretty good. They've got a pretty good timing response out of the box. So the red curve, we can see that the green and the red curve is pretty much identical. They're pretty much time aligned. But by the time we get to 7 milliseconds, this peak here is almost the same level as the direct sound. And
Wow.
this is what causes the blurring of the sound,
Mhm.
and the you kind of get directional cues that are kind of like 7 milliseconds later, but it's at the same level as the direct sound, and it just doesn't sound right, right? So,
Yeah.
and then
Wow.
further on, we still getting some big peaks and dips, and again, kind of not following the minimum phase response that we can see in red there. And one of the things I just wanted to share as well, like, I mean, I get all sorts of interesting texts and messages and emails and such about, oh, well, DSP is only good on axis, or DSP, radically changes the sound if you move the microphone off axis. And you know
Mm.
what? That's just rubbish. That's just pure rubbish. I mean, either your speakers are garbage or the DSP is garbage. That shouldn't be the case in either case. So
Mm.
here's an example and this is only using one analysis measurement right in the middle. So I stuck the mic in the middle, using, in this case, Accurate, and took one analysis measurement. Out of that measurement, I created a set of filters, and then I took the REW and the measurement microphone in around a 6 foot by 2 foot grid, and in my 9 foot equilateral triangle, and I took 14 measurements around. So 6 feet across my couch and 2 feet kind of leaning forward and back. That pretty
Mhm.
much covers the listening area. And as you can see, it's perfectly smooth across the range. Of course, the further off axis that you move, in the case of, if I'm looking at the right-hand speaker and I'm looking at the back left corner,
Oh,
that's
right.
roughly almost 12 feet away from the speaker, and you're going to get a drop in the high frequency response just because of the distance.
Amplitude
But
wise, you know, about
amplitude-wise,
amplitude.
but
Yeah.
it's still all smooth, right? And
Yeah.
then you look at the timing response, and this is another myth that people seem to think that, oh, the time alignment for the speaker is only good at one position. No, it is good at all the positions. And as you can see, the proof's in the pudding where, I've got that perfect step, right triangle step response for the first 5 milliseconds or so. And it follows the general shape over time. But here we're seeing, when I've got the mic towards the back of the room, that literally is 3 feet from the back of my back wall. And
I
so
see.
we're getting those reflections are starting to come into the response, but the direct sound and the kind of the most important first 5 milliseconds of travel of sound, it's perfect at any position on the couch. So, we've also got some nice cardioid speakers out there with onboard DSP. So it's not only, this is part of the advancement of DSP. It's not only separate products that do room correction, but there's also speakers like the Key 3s and the Dutch and Dutch 8Cs that have cardioid response. That definitely helps with the speaker boundary interference pattern that I was mentioning earlier. That pretty much takes it out of the equation. It's still a bit lumpy, as you can see, but I wanted to just show the improvement that one can get just by using the onboard parametric EQs. It's not perfect. There's some variability for sure. But you can see once you get past, the diffusion zone in my room from a little bit around about 600 hertz in this case, this response is perfectly smooth after that, and then a little bit lumpy down there.
You're making me envious here. I can't afford either of those speakers, but I would love to. If you have a pair of Key or Dutch and Duchess you want to donate to me, viewers, feel free.
That's awesome,
I
man.
take
Yeah.
donations anytime.
Excellent. And just to show, that it's not as smooth as some of the other responses that you've seen, and
Yeah.
but it's moving in the right direction. Again, because of the limitation of the number of fur filter taps that are on board the speaker, there's only so much you can do. You can't get it fully under control.
Mm.
And I think, but I just want to make a point here. So. Do you think I can tell the difference if both of those speakers were playing and I was able to switch A and B? Do you think I'd be able to tell the difference between the two speakers?
No.
That's right. That's
No, you
right.
wouldn't.
So,
Yeah.
this is the other funny thing that, people seem to think that, hey, if I EQ the speaker A and speaker B to be exactly the same, they're still going to sound different. No, they're not.
No, they're
It's
not.
just simply not the case. And I'd put up a blind test on that anytime. Yes, and there are still some anomalies, and I'll be the first to admit it.
Yeah.
Uh, there are some differences, and I've measured DSP systems where the bass response is almost identical, yet listening to it, the quality of the bass is different, and
Really?
so
So that goes
it
against them so that kind of
no,
refutes then
not
what I
quite,
just said.
because no, not quite, and the reason I'm saying that the difference is in the time domain. And so,
Okay.
there's kind of an overcorrection going on, and it can, it's kind of like the difference between, really dry or lifeless bass versus bass that sounds kind of dynamic, and the difference is in the timing.
Gotcha.
So, just kind of getting close to, the end of the presentation.
Okay.
I just wanted to offer, a perspective from the field. I've been in the field for a long time. I've had kind of two lives, one kind of a professional, software development life, and the other kind of just in the music world and sound world as much as I can.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I, I started out with a Uri graphic equalizer in 1977,
Mhm.
analog equalizer, and since then I've tried all sorts of systems. I even had a TEF computer that was one of the first measurement systems that could measure sound in 3 dimensions way back then. And I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in over the years. It's crazy. And then,
Yeah.
since I opened up my business last year, about a year ago, since then I've kind of DSP'd well over 100 sound systems. And
Wow.
the different kinds of systems that have come my way have been just, I mean, part of the thrill for me, Thomas, is kind of interacting with these folks remotely from wherever they are, and what systems, how did they arrive there? How did they arrive
Yeah.
at what they purchased? And I've seen some pretty wild systems that are very fascinating, very interesting.
Yeah.
And, and typically I ask for, like, I need pictures of your room. What are the room dimensions, of course, because we want to work out what the Schroeder is in the diffusion zone, what
Hmm.
gear are you using. And I've got the before and after DSP frequency and timing responses. And what's interesting is that some patterns have emerged from that data.
Hmm.
And, the first is that, regardless of what room you're in, you're more than likely going to get at least 20 dB of peak-to-peak variation in the low frequency response, for the very reason of standing waves and room modes. And the physical dimensions of the room are going to dictate that. There's not much you can do about that. 50% of the systems that I work with had at least one, and some up to 4 subwoofers. And there's a lot of talk about multiple subs and how it can balance out the room modes, and it can, and to a certain degree. But the reality is that you still need DSP, and in fact, in some cases, with more subs, the response can actually get worse. And the way it can get worse is that if you got, just imagine a front pair of subs at the front of your
Hmm.
room and a rear pair of subs, but they're not out of phase. And so you're getting huge additions and subtractions in the frequency response, up to 30 dB or more variances. And that's a real headache. And then you have to get into, flipping the polarity, adjusting the phase or delay control.
Right.
And it's
Right.
just more tuning effort required.
So you
I
have
just
more
want
energy. You have more energy in the room to deal with.
at
But
different
at different
locations,
locations. Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
And so the DSP room correction can take that into consideration, and does a great job regardless of how many subs that you have. The point I'm making is that it just doesn't necessarily mean that if you stuff the room with subs or have 4 subs that somehow you're going to get a nice smooth response. It's not always the case.
Right.
The other part of it, of course, is that we talked about earlier, is the timing response. And so, and again, it's not about localization. People get all wound up about, oh, well, the subs are, 80 hertz or greater, I can localize the sound. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the time arrival of direct sound, the time arrival of the low frequency reflections in the room, that gives you the sense that, the bass doesn't sound clear. Lots of bass, and may even be smooth bass, but it's not clear bass. And that's, again, due to the timing that we
I see.
talked about earlier. I've tried to give people, when they use my service, they usually get a partial frequency correction filter and a full range. They get up to 6 filters actually, and we kind of go through a bracketing process of finding their preference.
Okay.
And it's interesting to me that there's so much going on about don't EQ above Schroeder, or actually the diffusion zone, when we want to get
Mhm.
technically correct about it.
Mhm.
But it's the ear of the beholder, right? And so most people like the full range correction because they do have a preference as to how much high frequency energy is coming at their ears. And I'm not talking about using a treble control, a shelving control. It's the tilted response that
Mhm.
we're after. And you know the if I've forgotten his name, Peter Walker, I think it was, in the Quad Days, had an actual contour or a tilting control.
Yeah.
He had it right 40 years ago. Whatever
Yeah.
happened to that, man? That's
I think
the thing that blows
I
my
think
mind.
I think NAD I think NAD I think NAD these days, their tone controls are based on that contour, if I'm not mistaken, on that contour
Well, that'd be cool if
concept.
it is.
Yeah, I
That'd
think
be
so.
cool.
Yeah.
And then, we've kind of got two kind of main target responses. Some people like kind of more of a flat and then a tilted response. That's the traditional, what we call the ITU, EBU, or Bobcat's curve
Mhm.
that people listen to. Or there's more towards the Harman curve, which is kind of that tilted, like we saw in that
Gradual,
digital room correction,
kind
the
of
gradual
gradual,
tilt.
yeah,
And,
it's gradual sloping.
that's right. And even, the old B&K curve
Oh, that's right.
is kind of that kind of tilting slope over time.
Mhm.
So, it's kind of interesting. And I've got kind of all of these responses. I plan to kind of anonymize these results and put it in another edition of the DSP book that I wrote.
Mhm.
Because when you see all of these things overlaid, it's very clear that regardless of sound system, regardless of people's experiences or their ears, the vast majority of people kind of fall within, I hate to say it, the bell curve of,
Sure.
what it is that they like as far as sound coming at their ears.
Sure.
And it is exactly what's described in this presentation earlier on the different operational room response curves. Not too many people vary outside of that. There is some flexibility. Some people like a lot more bottom end than others,
Mhm,
bass
mhm.
that is. And so that's no problem to kind of dial it in, but that's the kind of the variability that most people will have, is how much bass response. But as far as mid-range and treble, most people kind of fall in that range of, like, they just like to hear a balanced sound, right?
Yeah.
And just a few more things. I think we've talked about this to a certain degree, but
Yeah.
definitely there's a wide difference between poorly implemented DSP and state-of-the-art DSP.
Mm.
There's a big difference, and so the I just wanted to point that out. And some of the stuff we've talked about. Some of these systems are fully automated. There's nothing you can adjust. There's no user adjustments, and so whatever it produces is what you're stuck with.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, it's not very good. They can only produce a kind of a generalized result, and it may not suit your specific environment. And in other words, it's not custom tailored for your speakers in your room, kind of thing. They can do a generalization, and that's about it.
I
And
see.
some of these, like over 75% of these DSP systems don't have time domain correction capabilities. So only half the transfer function is being corrected. So, if you really want to get the best frequency and timing response, there's only a handful of products that can actually do that today
I see.
out there on the market. And so something to look at very clearly. And it's once you kind of tune into it, it starts to become very easy to hear the difference between the two systems, especially in the bass response, when you can hear nice smooth bass response with both systems, but one seems to be much clearer than the other, and that's because the time domain is being taken care of.
I
Those low
see.
frequency reflections that are going around the room are being smoothed towards the ideal minimum phase response. So
I see.
that's something that's pretty important. And these few DSP systems that I'm talking about, they're far head and shoulders above everything else in the field.
And I guess and one thing is that they're not terribly expensive, these things.
No,
As it compares to in the audiophile product world, as compared to a preamp or an amplifier, or boutique speaker cables or other accessories, other things that don't have nearly the kind of effect that these DSP products would.
yeah, absolutely. It's most of them are under $500 US, right?
That's a
I mean,
pittance. That's a
it's a
pin. That's a
pittance.
yeah.
It's wildly ironic to me that such a small amount of money can make such a huge difference to a system, the sound of a system, to get accurate sound, even if it's nothing more to balance the fact that you've got your stereo system off center in your room, and you want to balance its sound so that it's the stereo image is correct
Yeah.
and there's a dead center, phantom center image. Just even for that alone is worth the price of entry, aside from correcting for the bass response in the room, and adjusting any tonal qualities that you would like to, adjust appropriately for the type of music and the type of room that you have. I mean, like I say, the modern DSP software, we can virtually produce textbook responses in the frequency and the time domains for virtually any speaker in any room, and that's how powerful it's become. And just to reiterate the point, one you've already brought up earlier, Floyd's research showed that bass subjectively accounts for 30% of how we judge speaker sound quality. So, and any speaker can sound better after room EQ, right?
Yeah.
And this is a really important point, and why I think it should just be standard in every speaker that you buy. But we've got a ways to go before
Yeah.
that happens. And of course, Floyd kind of just reiterates the same thing that I've been saying, that most rooms would estimate like 80% have serious bass coloration. Like,
Yeah.
in other words, the majority of rooms. And like I say, there's no hiding away from the way that room acoustics and the physics of standing waves and room reflections work in the room. It's just simply that's the reality. And
Yeah.
so I mentioned it before, and that really begs the question, like, how many audiophiles and audio enthusiasts are actually listening to smooth and clear bass in the room? I would say it's based on all of the measurements I've received over the last year. It's an extremely small percentage out of that group, and then of course they're very surprised to hear the bass
Hmm.
quality from their system once they've got some DSP in there.
Right.
So and like you say, it is inexpensive, right? And so under $500 can get you kind of the state-of-the-art software DSP, a calibrated USB measurement microphone's like $100.
Hmm.
Or if you prefer not to deal with a USB mic, a good analog mic and mic preamp is $200 and up. And as I mentioned before, the computer-based, software-based DSP systems are far more powerful than most hardware-based systems. There's a couple of exceptions to that. That
Wow.
Yuli over at Accurate has a Raspberry Pi solution that can hold 65,536 filter taps. So
Wow.
something kind of worth exploring. But like I say, those exceptions are far and few between. And after kind of getting feedback from a variety of folks that have used my service over the last year, they always run into the same situation when they go and listen to their filters. How can I easily switch between filters? How can I level match the filters?
All
And
right.
it's always a pain in the butt to work that. So I developed a convolver that I'll be releasing in the few months that takes care of those problems. I can switch in real time between two filters or no filter and a filter with no interruption in the sound, and you can distinctly hear the improvement and not improved or what have you in the switching of filters. So
So this is a
that's
pop. This is like, yeah, you can quickly pop it on, pop it off. Did you say there was a remote control possible way to do that, or is this
um,
something you have to do? You have to get up. You have to do. How do you
oh,
engage or disengage it?
it's a remote control. It's just a mouse and keyboard, right? It's just a piece of software. So
Oh,
it's
gotcha.
a DSP software.
Mhm.
It's it's similar to a convolver in JRiver or Rune or
Okay.
HQ
Mhm.
Player, but it's
Yeah.
separate and it's something that you can switch and monitor. You can also fine tune the level balance between filters and no filter, and it switches seamlessly. And so there's no time delay, no glitching, no browse for another filter and bring that in and try and switch.
Oh, I
It
see.
alleviates all these problems to have just instant switching so that I can evaluate which filter I like the best.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, yeah, I like the fact that you brought up that Yuli at Accurate has a Raspberry Pi solution that does the taps, because I was thinking I had a question here at the end that was exactly that. Like, how easy would it be to have a Linux-based box, a Linux-based box, because you don't want to deal with Mac upgrades or Windows upgrades, and you want to as clean as possible OS, and Linux seems to be the OS of choice to do that. But how easy would it be just to pop one of these convolvers onto a Raspberry Pi and run everything through that, you know?
When my software is released, it'll be really easy.
Yeah, well, there you go. So look out for his software, okay? Is this the first time you're announcing the software to somebody?
Yes, it is, and
It's a
so
world
the
premiere, folks. This is a world premiere. You heard it here first at HionHiFi.
well, if I can get it done, I have to revert back to C++ programming, and man, that makes my head hurt. But it's been fun.
So, so what else you got? Is that it? You got more?
That's it, Thomas. I
But, one of the questions I had is, what's your favorite DSP program? You know, you have Dirac, Accurate, OpenDRC, you have so many different ones. What's your favorite?
Well, I mean, Accurate and Audio Lens are probably my most two favorite, and one that's just coming on the market now called Focus Fidelity. I've got a review of that one coming out on AUDIOPHILE Style in the next week or so. So those are kind of the Focus Fidelity is kind of a newcomer to game.
Mhm.
Both Yuli from Accurate and Burnt from Audio Lens. Um, Truly produced the best top-notch DSP software out there, bar none, as far as I'm concerned. And have been around for 10 years, plus 10 years, and both of them have been extremely helpful to me
Mhm.
over the past 10 years. So I've got nothing but excellent, fantastic support. And, you know, one's more kind of UI driven and the other's kind of more like Excel macro driven, if you will, as a
Mhm.
comparison. You know, but for regular two channel, you know, DSP, both are equally easy to use. I think where the divergence comes in is when you've got multiple subwoofers or
Oh,
you're
yeah.
into digital crossovers. The workflows are different for both of them,
Mhm.
and one's more automated, one's a little less automated. But at the same time, if there's experiments that you want to try and you know you're looking for a particular function, one has the full complete toolbox. The other's more tailored towards you know kind of DSP room correction. The other is just tailored for just digital audio
You could do
manipulation.
yeah, you could
You can
do
do
anything with it,
anything. You can do anything
and that would
with
be
it.
accurate. That would be
That's
accurate.
that's correct. Um,
Audio lens is more room correction kind of, focused.
Focused, yeah, that's right. And you know, not to choose one or the over the other. They're both excellent programs. You know, you have to understand that what you're doing is you're developing a custom finite impulse response filter to reverse the frequency response and timing response effects of both the loudspeaker in a room and the room, and over you know all these parameters of frequency dependent windowing and you know Schroeder and diffusion zone. I mean, it's wildly complicated, and that's one of the reasons why I put the presentation together, because at least it has some pictures that I can talk around to try and help folks visualize you know what's going on. It's a crazy you know complicated thing, and I think that's where you know perhaps most of the adoption hasn't really happened. I mean, it's one thing to have the thought of you know um, I've had bad DSP experiences, and I have too, or bad equalization experiences, or just not knowing what's going on and just turn it off and that kind of thing,
Mhm.
versus you know I got to spend quite a bit of time. I got to take practice getting measurements. I've got to try and understand what those measurements mean. How do I use the software? At what level do I apply the correction? How do I know what the length of the frequency dependent window
Yeah,
is?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it's
holy
like it makes
smokes.
your head spin already. Yeah,
Yeah, right. And so, you know, I've tried to put on some online guides on how to use them and a book that goes into gory detail about that. But even still, I mean, it's effort, right?
yeah.
And
It
so, but it just takes time, right?
takes time, yes,
It's a
to
big
digest it
learning
all.
curve. You could build you know a digital audio course and have you know a
Yeah,
class for many months on the subject and practice, and you
yeah.
know it's kind of the same thing. I mean, you know, years ago I did some teaching instructing around recording engineering. I worked for the Columbia Academy of Recording Arts here in Vancouver, and did
Sure.
exactly that. Taught, recording engineering and the like. And it's one thing to have an ear, but it's another thing to kind of get all the mechanics down and understanding decibels and loudness levels. And there's a lot to consume, and it does take time and effort to do it, but it's highly rewarding,
Yeah.
if you're kind of into that thing.
Yeah. And so that leads me to the next question is, I noticed that you prefer horn speakers, and in all the years that I've been reading all your things, they've been some giant 15-inch woofer with a horn somewhere. What's your speaker preference, or do I need to ask? Oh, there we
There's
go.
You can probably see it behind me there.
Yeah. Are those 15s
Yeah,
or 12s?
those are double 15s,
Oh,
and
geez.
then
Yeah.
I've got a couple of double 18 or dual 18 subs on the floor. But
Oh,
yeah,
Jesus.
so probably about 3,000 watts of power going below 600 hertz, and so yeah, I can make the room move pretty good.
Yeah.
So the horn speakers, I have to admit, I'm so old school.
Yeah.
I use the modern waveguides. I like constant directivity devices. I mean, if
Mhm.
I was going to choose a non-horn speaker, it'd probably be something like along the lines of Dutch and Dutch,
Yeah.
or others. They've kind of caught on to the fact. I mean, if you look at the proverbial 1-inch dome tweeter, now a lot of companies are kind of placing those in shallow horns, if you will, to
Yeah.
kind of give it more. I just like the fact that very little power produces some good sound with, I mean, almost zero distortion. All right.
Yeah.
So there's no distortion coming off those things, no matter how loud you turn it up.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, I mean, they're designed. I mean, those cinema speakers sitting behind me, they're designed for 300 or 400, people, cinemas, right? And so I've just got them hanging in my living room. I
Yeah.
barely use anything out of them, but when I do turn them up, I mean, it's like, it'd be the same thing if I used to have my drum set up here, and so I'd play along with the drums, listening to the tunes, and I could actually hear
Yeah.
both
Definitely.
at the same time, because as you well know how loud drums are, right?
Oh, definitely.
So
Yeah, they cut through they can cut through, anything.
yeah.
Usually the, audio engineer is like, cutting drums down, they cut through that snare drum snap is yeah, the
Yeah, it's a nice
bass.
crack. I like it when it's loud enough that it makes your eyes blink every time
Yeah.
it hits.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding, man.
that's old school. That's an old
I,
school audio engineer for you right there.
yeah, that's right. I like it. I've been at clubs where the crack makes your ears blink, and the kick makes you feel it right in the stomach, right? And it's just like, oh yeah, this is awesome. It's a
Yeah,
visceral kind of
yeah.
experience, right?
I've arrived. I've arrived, yeah. We're at a show now.
I mean, the main reason is the constant directivity waveguide. That's the main reason. So the on-axis response is the same as the off-axis. So
Okay.
that's the whole point. So if I EQ it on-axis in the top end, as I move off-axis, it's predictable. It's exactly what the response is going to be.
I
That's
see.
not quite the same with passive two-way box or three-way box speakers, because part of the problem is that there's phase shift that's being introduced, and so not only with the time misalignment, but the actual passive crossovers themselves. And so when you EQ it off on axis and you move it off axis, there is possibility of detriment to the sound for those kinds of speakers.
I see.
However, having said that, over the years, it's gotten much better.
Yeah. Anyway,
Exactly.
yeah, so, do you listen to records?
So I've still got a box of records, a couple of okay. Yeah, I've got about 500 records hanging around that I still have that
You can be honest, it's alright. It's
I always
alright.
feel guilty that I've got a record collection, right?
It's alright. After this whole 2-hour escapade, all he listens to is records. 6 bits of resolution here, folks.
That's right. That's right. So I don't have a turntable anymore. I used to. I used to be a fanatic, one of those guys that
Yeah.
fiddle with the turntable, the vertical tracking angle. Oh my God, man, the viscosity of the oil. I mean, it's ridiculous, right?
Yes. I think
So
that's I think that's part of the fun for many audiophiles.
Oh,
That
absolutely, tinkering.
yeah, yeah, just that part. I mean, and no, it's no wonder that many of them are engineer types. You know, they
Yes.
like that. They like the ability to, because it gives their brain, that's just their personality. It suits their personality. You know.
Yeah, I plan on transposing those records when I get a table again. But yeah, no, I don't listen to records anymore.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Um. So let's say so this is these are some questions that I ask everyone. What can't the measurements tell us about sound quality, or can they tell us all that we need to know?
That's a great question. I mean, so far, I'm of the mind that they can tell us almost everything we need to know about the characteristic of sound. I know there's some things, and it's kind of weird, right? I mean, some things you have to kind of figure out what the translation is, and I'll give you an example. So, tube amps and solid state amps. Okay, so there's a variety of distortion measurements. I mean, guys like Nelson Pass, he produces amplifiers that have distortion spectra that is designed to give it a particular sound. And so I happen to be a fan of that. It's not necessarily accurate, but there is a difference. So I can definitely tell a difference between one of those Purify amps that I had here for a review, which was ultra clean, super low distortion, no distortional, versus one of my Nelson Pass amps that has quite a bit of distortion, or one of my tube amps that I've got that has distortion. There is a distinct characteristic about that. I think it does translate into measurements, damping factor,
Mhm.
um, also I think the main culprit is the distortion spectra of what it looks like, is what gives it that characteristic sound. So, I have yet to come across anything that kind of, I haven't been able to explain or measure that I
Oh,
can't really, put a finger on, why does it sound that way? Well, if I look at the measurement, it says this. And so I try and do some correlations on that. So I'm of, they say the impulse response describes everything there is to know about the sound. And I would have to agree with that.
another question is, um, do you think there's a anti-science bias in in this hobby that we have?
Holy smokes. Wow, man. Yeah, that's let me go on record by saying, uh,
It's like I'm
I,
holding a microphone up to you. Like, what do you think? We're all waiting. We're all waiting. We're all waiting.
I think in general, the trend I've seen, anyways, and I may be completely wrong, but there's just an anti-science in everything going on today. So
You're right, brother.
I would have to say that,
Yeah,
in
we're not
audio,
spared. Audiophilia has not been spared from that, and companies are selling you things based off of pseudoscience.
yes, 100% agreed. I just, I mean, that's what kind of got me started, to be honest. I
I
was
think it got a
hearing,
lot of people started that way.
yeah,
Yeah,
right. And
they bought
it's like,
into it. Yeah,
yeah.
and you were like, "Oh, that's cool. I want it. I want that. Sure, who doesn't?"
And so I was testing that like earlier, in probably in 2011 or something like that. I wrote some blog posts for Chris over there at AudioPhile Style, or Computer Audio at the time, because it was computer audio, and I was looking for somewhere to hang out, and I had computer audio too, so two and two, right? And
Yeah, sure.
so I was hearing all this, like, all this music player sounds different than that music player, and I'm like, what? Like, if it's bit perfect, how can it sound different?
Right.
Okay, I'm not saying that everything is measurable and life is all neatly tied up in a math equation. I really don't know, and I have an opinion like everyone else. But when I can apply science and compare the outputs of one thing versus the other, and they're identical, and if I'm listening to it and it sounds identical, well, right? I mean, I'm not going to go too much further than that. I mean,
Sure.
when you've removed everything else and it's only the obvious that's left, I
Yeah.
mean,
And what do you think the most important component in a high fidelity audio system is?
speakers in room, and
Okay.
and I mean, you saw the response variations in the graphs. I mean, those are totally measurable and totally audible and of large, magnitude.
If you had to choose one, speakers or room.
I would have to go with the DSP, and it's just a simple, like, I mean, regardless of speaker, if I drop a speaker in my room and I hear that uneven bass response, it doesn't matter how much money I've spent on the speaker, or better speaker or not so good speaker. It's going to interact with my room the same way. I'm going to get like 20 dB of variation. One bass note's going to be louder, one bass note's going to be really quiet. And, once you've kind of tuned into that, you can't live without it. I mean, and so that would be the thing that I would focus in on for me. And the reason I'm saying that is because I would say, to a large degree, digital audio is completely ubiquitous. It is just everywhere, and been solved, I think, over and over for decades. There's fine tunings, sure, but generally speaking, I mean, when I was in the studio in 1984, we're using, the digital audio recorders, the input-output stages, some of the analog stages, they're much better. But as far as the digital audio piece is concerned, it's the same thing
That's
40
exactly.
years ago.
I've been saying that. I've been saying that same thing, bitch. I have, for the funny thing is, I started out in audio with, kind of disillusioned, and I started to understand exactly what you're saying about digital audio and how bits are bits. Um, but only now, when I'm a little bit older, more mature, and have more sense of myself, that I'm able to kind of buck the trend of, okay, this, all the flowery words that reviewers use to describe audio products and things like that, and being on the inside, having written a few reviews, and then being on the inside and seeing the editorial process, and just some experiences that I've had, I saw really what was going on, the machinery of
Right,
hi-fi press. And folks,
right,
if you don't know, there the hi-fi press is just like any other, system. There's there's graft. They don't have your best interests at heart in some cases. And a lot of things that are, when the advertisers are the people who are providing the most income for that establishment, you can bet your best interests are probably not the highest interests. Not in every case, okay, but that's just usually not. That's usually the way it goes. Follow the money is what I'd say. So that leads me to, what's your take on the hi-fi press?
I
You don't have to
don't.
get controversial like me. I can be controversial because I'm a nobody. You have a business, and you might not want to step on toes. I don't. I'm a nobody. I don't care whose toes I step on.
Oh, that's funny, man. That's funny, Thomas. I just don't listen. I just don't listen to the hi-fi press. I'm not,
Yeah,
I'm looking at, articles on science, on,
yeah.
is there a better way to produce a speaker? Is there
Okay.
some better way to look at the room, the interface to the room? These kinds of things. Always on the lookout for, cool speakers. That's probably, I've got a soft spot for speakers, sometimes vintage
Hmm.
speakers, like the L-Tech Voice of the Theater, stuff like that.
Yeah,
Love
yeah,
that kind of stuff. And, you
yeah.
know, that's the kind of, but I don't listen to too much of the press. There's a few speakers that have come out that are, very interesting, and would
Hmm.
love to hear them, but today it's kind of not possible.
Yeah, right. Okay. That's funny. It's funny that you should bring up this Altec Voice of the Theater, and speakers like that. I've long wanted to pick up a pair of those, but I've just been warded off so many times by, the issues that they might come with. So I never took the plunge. Many of them would probably need refurbishing, and even then, I'm not sure how the bass response would be. Those woofers back then, those with those Alakino,
Alna
those
Covies, yeah.
yeah, those magnets. Um, yeah, I'm just not sure how they would transplant today, and if they're competitive today. What do you think?
Yeah, probably not. And in fact, I know they're not. But
Yeah,
it is a vintage sound.
yeah,
And people are clubs, people fix those things up, and there's mods you can make and all that stuff. And mostly, it's kind of, I would say, it's more about nostalgia
right.
than anything else, right? I mean, they're compared to like a Dutch and Dutch HC,
Not
aside
even
from,
not in the
not
same
even
ballpark.
close. Yeah, not
Yeah.
even close. I mean, aside from maybe some volume difference, but as far as sound quality difference, yeah, not even in the same realm.
Yeah, we're talking, and we're talking, and just to be clear, we're talking about fidelity here. Hi-fi fidelity. And we're talking about things that you can generally measure. Distortion.
That's right.
Off-axis, on-axis response. Those things that are that are in our purview, not things that are, that are intangibles. What's the value proposition? Do you like the wood finish of it and all those kinds of things? Those are things that you might choose a voice of the theater for, because over a Dutch and Dutch, because you like those those other things. But
Right.
those are purely subjective and not objective things. So just a couple more questions, Mitch, and then I'll let you go, I promise. um, um, so so there's FIRs, and there's FIRs, and there's IRRs, IR,
IIR, yeah.
IIRs. There's Okay, so if the best DSP products, correct me if I'm wrong, use a combination of both of those. Is that correct?
I would say that the best currently today is all FIR, so fur filters is, and the reason is that the IIR filter provides no mechanism for adjusting time.
So
This is the issue.
why do they use, like, for example, Dirac uses the combination of the two, I think.
Correct. That's
So,
right. They do. They
and
use
why
IIR down low and FIR up top.
is that? Is that to save computing power?
I think it's a design decision, and I couldn't say exactly what the exact reasons are, but the thing with an IIR filter is that it has no time delay component to it. It's immediate. It's not like a fur filter where there's the number of taps. It takes time to go through the number of taps, right?
Hmm.
And so
So you
for
need the horsepower there. You need
well,
the you need something to
there's
churn through that.
there's horsepower, not as much as one thinks, but I think, like I say, the main difference between the two is one is able to provide a timing component correction and the other isn't. Why they chose not to have the timing component down low, that is a mystery to me. I know that a lot of other DSP software use IIR filters down low, and to these ears, they just they can smooth out the bass like they say, but the timing response is still all those big peaks and
Hmm.
disjointed timing. It's still there, and so like I say, there's differences in quite a few between software. I honestly think that I understand Dirac was probably going after more of the ease of use market. I mean, all you can
Right.
adjust on it is basically the target response.
Right.
And so, but that's still the issue. You can't adjust the amount of correction. You can, in fact, you can't adjust anything. And so, you get what you get, and you can't really adjust that, and so there are limitations to it. I mean, it's I think they're trying to edge in on a few other markets like Soundworks or what have you, that
Hmm.
are in the pro studio market and the like. But I'm just speculating at this
Sure.
point in time. But
Sure.
I do, and there is um, I should say that Focus Fidelity is a new product, DSP product,
Hmm.
coming online. I think it uses a mix of the two, but I may be wrong. That's something that I'd have to look at again
Okay.
to see. But yeah, currently the best on the market is fur only.
Okay. So Audio Lens and Accurate use fur.
Correct.
Use fur direct. Okay. And if you were going to recommend one of those components to someone, um, would it be like, to get a box like a Raspberry Pi, or a separate computer, or a Mac Mini or something like that, and use does Accurate and Audio Lens have a VST that you use, or are they separate programs within that you use on that you use within the computer? or the
Uh,
host?
yeah, so in the case of Audio Lens and Accurate, they have standalone convolvers that can run on the same computer system that you might be using to host, your music programs or your DAW workstation, or they can be placed on, a separate a computer as well. Not too many have the VST plugins, and mine that's coming out here in the next month or two will be released as with a VST plugin as well, as
Okay.
in addition to a standalone application.
Okay.
There's actually several different ones on the market that can, be used standalone, plug in on a separate computer or on the same computer that you're using, or a number of these music players already have convolution built in.
What is your product going to be? What's the name of it?
Hang loose convolver.
Hang loose. Hang
Yeah,
loose.
the idea is that it's got a whole pile of automation behind it, so that you can just hang loose and listen to your music and not have to worry about the crazy, configuration setups that happens. That's part of that's a transition from me being in the professional software development world for 25 years. I
Mhm.
find a lot of these products are kind of built by folks that are not from that industry, and
Mhm.
so usability and the user experience on how do
Yeah.
I get this going from zero to I'm listening to music,
Yeah. The UX
um,
part. The UX part. Yeah.
is difficult. And it takes effort to make it simple. In fact, the simpler it is, the more effort it takes, and
Yeah.
that's the unfortunate bit behind it.
Yeah. Engineers are very good engineers, but they're not. But it's key to note that engineers are not UX designers generally.
That's right, and I'm not either. And so I'm
So
I'm
you
in
need
the
to hire someone specific to that
and
task.
I have indeed. That's exactly what I've done. I mean, I'd be the first to admit it, and so I'll have I've got a designer that's already designed the UI for me, and I'm just in the process of putting that together.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to have it. But um, do you stream? Do you stream music? Do you stream like with
Um,
Qobuz or Tidal or something like that, or do you listen to mostly local music?
a bit of both, bit of both. So I do some streaming, Rune, Kobuz, but mostly local. And in fact, the thing that kills me is that at one point in time, when I was working at Microsoft, I had one of those, I can't remember, music passes or whatever, they just gave them away.
Hmm.
So the cool thing was is that you could always download the music and play it on your system, and the DRM was tied to the computer, the physical computer.
Hmm.
Then Windows 10 came and Groove came, and now they tied the subscription to the application rather than the computer. Well, of course, Groove
Oh,
doesn't have any DSP capability or any plugin capability, or
yeah,
so they kind of, and I can't explain why they would do that. I guess it's part of the wall garden thing that the
yeah,
Apple Macintosh has. But I would have done it the other way around, opened it up rather than closed it down.
yeah,
And so, I know that accessibility is kind of difficult with some of these streaming services, and some of the music players like Jay River refuses to,
they
and
do.
get involved in some of those. And to a certain degree, I don't blame them, because if you look at the history of all the ones that they've tried developing their software for,
Yeah,
man,
they're not around.
the graveyard is
They're not
littered with.
around. Yeah.
They're not around, right? And
Which one did you prefer, the Purify or the Camp, the ACA? If you
well,
just have to sit down, if you had to sit down, which one would you prefer to put on?
well, I mean,
Mhm.
I mean, I totally get perfect distortionless sound, but I also play a guitar with a tube amp that saturates the heck of the Class A, and I kind of like that crunchy sound. So, it may not be accurate, but it sure sounds good to my ears, right? So,
Yeah,
the ACA, it's limited in my sense. I've got it on the horns on my speakers, so they smooth out the horn sound a bit with
yeah,
that nice second harmonic distortion, and
yeah,
it's barely running. If you put it on a real pair of speakers, the bass is kind of bloated, like a
yeah,
tube amp would sound, and the top end's kind of got that glassy kind of sound to it.
yeah, steely.
Um,
Yeah.
It depends what mood I'm in, I suppose. But if I had to choose one, I guess I would have to choose the one that puts a smile on my face, and that's sorry, folks, more distortion. Thank you.
That's all right. You can do this after this whole after all this, we still go back to uh we still get back to the analog, the analog sound. It's just you can't escape being a human. For all the people watching, thanks for tuning in. I will put links to all of Mitch's contact information in the notes below. Comment, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. If you like what you see, an email. If you have something that you'd like to see in the future, or people you'd like me to interview in the future, please comment down below. I'd love to be able to have a conversation with you. Thanks for watching.